anarchy.
This is what Seattle's autonomous zone looked like as protests against police brutality gripped the city.
Chaos.
Protesters on Seattle's Capitol Hill are fighting for change from the police and city.
Violence.
Breaking news in the so-called Capitol Hill organized protest zone. There's been yet another shooting early this morning.
In the year 2020, a section of Seattle was given to protesters to self-govern, leading to a real-life purge. And soon enough, things would turn deadly. So today we'll look at one of the most dangerous social experiments in modern American history. On May 25th, 2020, a 46-year-old black man named George Floyd was murdered by a white police officer named Derek Chauvin, an already problematic cop in a particularly problematic police precinct in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Although the details around this specific incident are a topic for another day, the important thing about this event is what it led to all over the United States. America and its tense relationship between various police forces and members of the black community are well known. And with the murder of George Floyd coming at a time during a string of police killings, along with the restless public cooped inside due to the COVID lockdowns, the political tides were nothing less than a bomb waiting to go off. This led to widespread protests and demonstrations in not just the United States, but around the world, some continuing to this very day. As of 2022, it's estimated that since these protests began, it has led to 19 deaths, 14,000 arrests, $550 million in property damage in Minneapolis alone, with another $1 to $2 billion in uninsured property damage around the United States. This leads us to the Great Northwest to observe one of the most chaotic protests in the aftermath. Within Seattle, Washington, there is a residential district just east of downtown called Capitol Hill. Although Seattle in general has a strong progressive culture, Capitol Hill specifically has a storied history of being a prominent counterculture hotbed. Known for its vibrant nightlife, strong ties to the gay community, and being the site of several historic protests already, it was a natural habitat for a strong resistance movement against the police. The Capitol Hill neighborhood became the site of intense interactions between protesters and law enforcement, beginning in June of that year. The police were already under intense scrutiny, having been placed under federal oversight in 2012 after a pattern of excessive force and biased policing. Cops in full riot gear set up a perimeter to protect the SPD's East Precinct building. Due to the reason for these protests, it took only approximately 60 seconds for things to go from tense to violent, and it all started with a purple umbrella. In footage from the day, you see an officer grab a woman's umbrella, which quickly turns into a tug of war, as she doesn't want to relinquish it. Police soon pull out pepper spray and begin using it indiscriminately against the crowd. Before long, police efforts to scatter the crowd began with them using blast balls, flashbang grenades, and eventually tear gas. A few days later, on June 5th, Mayor Jenny Durkin announced a 30-day ban on the use of tear gas. And so with the non-lethal tool of the police department effectively stripped away from them, the situation only grew more dangerous. On June 7th, the brother of an officer attempted to drive straight through the crowd. As one protester attempted to stop him, the driver pulled out a Glock and shot the man point blank. He promptly got out of the vehicle and turned himself into the police at the barricades without incident. By midnight, the situation grew in intensity, as police claimed protesters were throwing various objects at them, such as bottles and rocks, leading to them resuming the use of tear gas, pepper spray, and flashbang grenades. All of this despite the mayoral ban. As a result, over 12,000 complaints were filed against the Seattle Police Department, with many claiming that the cops' assertion of being subjected to a barrage of thrown foreign objects was a strong embellishment of what actually occurred, to justify their use of the now banned riot control methods. At this point, the police boarded up and vacated the precinct building in an effort to de-escalate the situation. Protesters then repositioned barricades in a one-block area and declared the zone Free Capitol Hill, And with that, a new nation was founded. With the police having withdrawn from the area entirely, the protesters immediately expanded Free Capitol Hill to encompass 5 city blocks, erecting barriers that served to both block the incoming traffic and also to establish the borders of their new occupied zone. The SPD precinct building sign was altered to now read Seattle People's Department. All along the barricades, signs went up saying, "Now entering Free Capitol Hill," and "You are now leaving the USA." And from there, the new country began a social experiment to see if they could actually do a better job running things than the United States government. But believe it or not, dark days were ahead, as things would break out into full anarchy. We'll learn more about this after a brief word from our sponsor. In the modern age, it's so easy to eat flat-out garbage food that makes you feel terrible afterwards. But thankfully, today's sponsor, HelloFresh, can help with this problem. This meal delivery service will give you pre-portioned, high-quality ingredients sent right to your house when they're at the peak of ripeness. And with clear directions, even if you've never cooked in your life, you'll still be able to follow the recipe and learn the ropes. And you might think it's more expensive, but that is actually not the case. According to a Zagat Dining survey, HelloFresh is up to 72% cheaper than dining out or grocery shopping. The service also caters to all types of dietary restrictions. I personally love the service because it allows me to be more adventurous with my eating since I don't have to worry about waste. Speaking of waste, HelloFresh is the first carbon-neutral meal kit company, and nearly all the packaging is recyclable. So to try it out for yourself, use my link in the description down below or go to HelloFresh.com and use code POGGFMJuly16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes, plus 3 free gifts. In a turn of events, Seattle had forfeited a section of the city to the protesters, and things started off surprisingly smooth. They established what they called the No Cop Co-op, providing drinking water, food, hand sanitizer, and snacks from the community. Citizens of the fledgling nation banded together to provide vegan cuisine and monetary donations for the homeless. Although the government had withdrawn its police force and the protesters declared themselves a new country, they still agreed to have the city trash removal come in to remove waste, and accepted COVID-19 testing from the city's public health department. Local black artists came in as well, spending 3 days creating a street mural an entire city block long spelling out the phrase "Black Lives Matter," which became a prominent image in news coverage of the new self-described nation. Although the demonstrators occupied a large swath of land in downtown Seattle, the early days showed promise. Restaurant owners declared a significant increase in walk-in traffic. A public outdoor movie theater showcasing films celebrating Black history had been set up. A community garden in Cal Anderson Park had been planted to grow food. Although the goals of the zone frequently shifted, its most commonly held theme was a strong opposition to police violence. Among the demands set forth to the city of Seattle, they asked that the police force receive a 50% reduction in funding, with the money being redirected to social and community programs that would benefit the city's homeless minority groups. Other demands that made their way to various lists included socialized healthcare and medicine, the release of all non-violent drug offenders currently in prison, free college, free public housing, removal of all Confederate monuments in the state of Washington, the degentrification of Seattle including rent control, employing Black doctors in Seattle's hospitals to care exclusively for Black people, a retrial for all people of color convicted of violent crimes, and the complete dissolution of the prison system. An internal government was established within the zone in the form of a general consensus assembly with no centralized leadership. Reporters described the atmosphere of the zone, comparing it to the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement mixed with the style of a college dorm co-op. Police were abolished within the zone, with security handled by armed volunteer guards who stood as sentries at the barricades monitoring all who entered. As the movement went into its second week, the protesters, concerned with imaging and its representation in the media, decided to officially change the name of their micronation from Chaz, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, to CHOP, Capitol Hill Occupy protest in an effort to better represent what they believed was the purpose of the movement. It was revealed in January of 2022 that shortly after the police withdrew from Capitol Hill, they began making fake calls of Proud Boy sightings within CHOP in an effort to scare and intimidate protesters, who they knew had been monitoring police radio chatter. With fears of violent clashes between black protesters and right-wing provocateurs, many within CHOP began to open carry, in fear of alt-right violence. And with this, the zone soon descended into lawlessness. Many residents of nearby apartments feared to open their doors or leave for any amount of time since there was no longer a police presence.
We're just sitting ducks all day because now every criminal in the city knows they can come into Chaz. They can do anything they want as long as it's not life-threatening, and the police won't come in and do anything about it.
And because police were no longer responding to calls within the zone beyond life-endangering incidents, looters began to ransack various businesses, leading some to hire private security firms armed with AR-15s and pepper spray to dissuade would-be robbers from destroying local establishments. Newspapers like the Seattle Times described the situation devolving back into the Pinkerton era. Unfortunately, it didn't take long before the anarchist utopia became a dystopian hellscape. Front and center in the news coverage was the various shootings that took place starting around June 20th. In the early morning at Cal Anderson Park, 2 people were shot, with one 19-year-old aspiring rapper named Lorenzo Anderson, or Little Mob, receiving multiple gunshot wounds. Because the protest was so strongly against police as an institution, officers attempting to respond to the incident said they had a difficult time reaching the scene due to protesters blocking their way. In the end, first responders were ultimately refused entry, with Anderson being transported to the hospital by volunteer CHOP medics. Tragically, Little Mob died at around 2:53 a.m. Many people within CHOP expressed outrage and sadness over the shooting, and fear of how it would detract from the message they were trying to send with their occupied protest. With the suspect nowhere to be found, many called on him or her to turn themselves in. One such protester, going by the name Dragon, went on to talk about it to a news reporter.
Turn yourself in, because if you don't, it's better that the police get a hold of you than they do.
Although the members of CHOP were divided on whether or not to allow police into the protest, everyone seemed to agree that the violence served only to undermine the efforts they had taken to effect change in their city. They could only hope that this shooting was an isolated case. Unfortunately, the very next day, on June 21st, a 17-year-old was shot in the arm. After receiving treatment at Harborview Medical Center, the same hospital where Lorenzo Anderson had died from his injuries the day prior, he was released. Although the shooting of this young teen was far less serious than the previous firing, having incidents on 2 consecutive days brought the full attention of the Seattle mayor's office and the city council. Compounded with numerous reports of rapes, assaults, arson, vandalism, burglary, and lawless street violence, city officials felt that they could no longer wait on the sidelines. Where they had tried to be patient and allow events to play out in the hopes that the protest would eventually dissolve on its own, murmurings of forcibly breaking up the protests began to make their way around decision makers at the city level. Mayor Jenny Durkin, whose support of Seattle police had led to the nearly unanimous ire of CHOP, said to reporters, "We cannot let acts of violence define this movement for change." The police chief Carmen Best, herself a black woman, said in the same news conference, "This is a debate about life or death. I cannot stand by not another second and watch another black man, or anyone really, die in our streets while people aggressively thwart the efforts of police and other first responders from rescuing them." Although the mayor and chief of police announced that the East Precinct would be opening again, CHOP demonstrators refused to disperse. At around this time, the city and the Seattle Police Department were hit with a class action lawsuit. Not from the protesters, but various residents, businesses, and property owners in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, claiming that the city had denied them due process by permitting the occupation to occur within the zone. Although many businesses like restaurants saw an increase in foot traffic, many others had to completely close down. And because government officials and police were not permitted within CHOP, these people were denied even some of the most basic city services that their taxes entitled them to. One member of the lawsuit, a property owner specializing in affordable housing, said, "These residents have become victims of an occupation better characterized today by its violence, chaos, and killings than anything else. Forcing us to choose between anarchy and police brutality is a false dichotomy. Compassion and law enforcement should not be mutually exclusive." By June 29th, many more shootings had occurred. Victims included a dead 16-year-old as well as an injured 14-year-old who was visiting CHOP from out of town. By this time, many of the well-wishers and tourists visiting had left, fearing for their safety. And all that remained was the most passionate and sometimes militant activists, who were far less likely to disperse. And with that, Seattle became a punching bag on the internet, with the Capitol Hill neighborhood rapidly descending into lawless anarchy, attracting some of the worst elements of society who had nothing to do with the original intent of the occupation. Mayor Jenny Durkan had had quite enough. While many of the protesters within Capitol Hill were resting their heads on July 1st, the mayor signed an executive order for the purpose of retaking the area. At 5:30 a.m., hundreds of police officers and FBI agents showed up to disperse the crowd. The group was not going to leave willingly, leading to not only dozens of arrests, but after Capitol Hill was cleared out, many returned throughout July in a game of King of the Capitol Hill. Many of the original protesters who had spent their time occupying the neighborhood were frustrated that after all the energy they spent, there wasn't any lasting change in policing. Protests made up by CHOP activists popped up all over the city the day it was cleared out, and on July 23rd, about 150 people showed up in the middle of the night at the former CHOP site. By July 25th, the crowd had grown to several thousand, with many protesting in solidarity of demonstrations occurring in cities like Portland. Not willing to give up ground, the Department of Homeland Security deployed agents to break up the demonstration. An attempted peaceful protest was organized and carried out a few days later. However, the SPD designated it a riot after several fires were set and businesses were vandalized, including the targeting of one owned by a relative of a police officer who had killed a pregnant black woman in 2017. In all, about 47 people were arrested and 21 police were injured. Shortly after this renewed attempt to occupy the Capitol Hill neighborhood once again, the city voted in favor of reducing the East Precinct's police force from around 1,400 to 100. By August 7th, the New York Times reported that many of the businesses and homes in the neighborhood remained boarded up and locked, and that many of the residents were no longer willing to speak about their experiences to the media, possibly in fear of retaliation. Several lawsuits were filed, including a wrongful death suit by the mother of Lorenzo Anderson. In October, it was also reported that a federal judge approved an attempt by 21 business owners to sue the city of Seattle for damages. The coffee capital of the world was widely criticized for its handling of the George Floyd protests in 2020, with much of that criticism and accountability being laid out before Mayor Jenny Durkan. Faced with backlash and opposition from all sides, she announced in December of 2020 that she would not be seeking re-election at the end of her mayoral term. So there you have the story of how protesters in Washington took over Capitol Hill. Not to be confused with the other time protesters in Washington took over the other Capitol Hill a few months later. And with that thought, I think I'll end the video here. So until next time, thanks for watching.